So I think we're going to put a really interesting spin on this resolution. So we're going to talk about a position that's currently elected in the United States government, and we're going to argue that that position ought to be appointed through a rather elaborate process that we've come up with. Specifically, we're going to be speaking about district attorneys who operate at the county level. So right now it's the case that they're elected by their local jurisdictions. Instead, we're going to set up a process where they're going to be appointed. Now, here's how this process is going to work. There's going to be a panel of judges and prosecutors that will evaluate the performance of assistant DAs already within the system, and among them, when terms come up for the given district attorney, are going to appoint a new district attorney. I want to make it clear, this panel of judges and prosecutors will be chosen by a compromise between the local executive, that is the county executive or city executive, the senator ever running it, in cooperation with the representatives of the civil service unions for the district attorneys. Now, it's not the case that these unions exist in the status quo, but we think they will exist under our plan. These will do the appointing of the evaluators. The evaluators will make the decision. I guarantee you this is the optimal solution. So to that end, I'll stop for questions in case we have any.
Okay, so just purely whoever's done like the best job.
Princeton doesn't stop. These questions better be fast.
Purely just like merit-based promotion based on assistant DA.
Right, yeah. Okay. So to that end then, we have three arguments for why we think this is a better system than the status quo system. First, and I think most obviously, this depoliticizes the process. So we think these decisions of who ought to be prosecutors at the local level, aren't decisions that voters should decide. Why is that? Because they aren't the decisions of policy making. That is, they aren't supposed to represent the values of the voters as made through law. What they're supposed to do is enforce the laws in a way that's consistent with the way the legislatures lay down the laws and the way the executive wants them to be enforced. We think they're similar to other sorts of executive agents where they're to enforce the laws rather than to actually be crafting new laws. And we think politicizing the process, which is currently what happens, is a bad thing. So we have three other reasons for why the process is depoliticized on our side of the House and why that's important. So first, we make it the case on our side of the House that we have a third party that's neutral for political investigations. So a lot of crimes, particularly things like voter fraud or abuse of government power, you need a neutral third party to be able to investigate them. Thank you. Now I know it's the case that I know this is a really subtle argument, so it's going to seem initially contradictory, the idea that we want someone who's responsible to the executive to be investigating the executive. That's actually exactly how it works at the federal level, right? So when there was investigations into Whitewater, we had Ken Starr, who was serving at the behest of then President Clinton investigating him. No, thank you. Why did that system work? Well, because although they were appointed politically, their job then becomes seen as something that is depolitical. Why? Because they don't have the incentive to try and get votes. All they have to do is serve the public interest, and there's a strong pressure on them to behave in a fair manner. So our third argument under this, though, is that we get less grandstanding. So one of the problems with the status quo is just there's this real potential for district attorneys to showboat high-profile cases, because that's what gets people to come out and vote. I'd refer you to the Duke lacrosse case, where you had a class example of a trial that became highly politicized because you had a district attorney in a majority black district wanting to get reelected by prosecuting this wealthy white lacrosse team. Our fourth and final argument under this is right now in the status quo, we think there's a strong incentive to over-prosecute. Now, why is that the case? Because what prosecutors are held accountable for by the voters are the crime rates. That is, are you getting people off the street? No, thank you. Are you getting criminals off the streets? Now, we think that's one role of prosecutors. We actually don't think that's the only role. They have to balance recidivism versus over-punishing and over-prosecuting. In some jurisdictions, the only thing that the voters are checking for is under-prosecuting, right? Because it's not like they're going to see high-profile cases of drug dealers going off to jail when they haven't done all that much wrong. And this is why we have so many young black men in prison for drug crimes in the status quo, because people just aren't checking for it because they aren't sensitive to these issues. So we think this type of risk aversion can be avoided. Go ahead.
You really think that when these DAs have their performance reviewed by a board that looks at their previous record, they're not also going to be looking for many successful prosecutions?
No, but the thing is, that will be one part of the evaluation. We agree it should be one part of the evaluation. What I think is that judges and prosecutors will also look at the other side. Will also look, are you abusing your power? Are you over-prosecuting? Are you trampling on minority rights in a way that we don't think that individual voters will be able to do? Our second argument today, then, is that this is going to make the system more meritocratic. And so first we're going to start with this, which I think is a really strong intuitive argument, which is that skill in the courtroom does not equal skill in political campaigning. one of the biggest problems right now with district attorneys is people who are effective at getting elected, at going to interest groups and getting votes from them, and having good get-out-the-vote efforts, don't necessarily make the most effective prosecutors who will make the best use of prosecutorial discretion and prioritize things rightly. So I don't think that these are the type of people that we should be selecting for. So then there's a second argument that follows from that, which is the problem with the status quo is voters won't read performance evaluations at all. All they'll know is these high-profile cases, now thank you, that have made it to the nightly news. So what we allow for is a system where the judges and the prosecutors on this panel can look back at the individual decisions the prosecutors have made, try and review them in a meritocratic way, say, are you living up to the standard? Now, we've got a second sub-argument under this for why we think these people will be uniquely well-situated to make the decision. We think, similar to the way that courts are calibrated by precedent, these reviewers will be calibrated by previous evaluations. They'll know what to look for in a good prosecutor, and they'll be able to make the right type of decision. No, thank you. Our final type of argument is that we get the right type of people going into prosecution. Why is it the case right now? Well, because there's just no upward mobility in prosecution for people who are apolitical. Why is that? If you want to go in as an assistant DA and you want to be like the best prosecutor possible, the problem is if you ever want to be the top guy, you have to stop focusing on prosecution and start focusing on electioneering. So this deters people who don't want to get involved in the political process from becoming prosecutors at the lower level. The consequence of this is right now assistant DAs are all politicians who want to get further up in campaigns and don't necessarily want to be people who are purely focused on prosecution. Our final argument is that we think this preserves executive accountability. Because right now it's often the case that the DA won't be of the same political party or won't be of the same political agenda as the executive. Now here are the consequences of that. First, the executive right now is in charge of implementing crime laws and crime policies at these local jurisdictions. But the problem is that people who are enforcing them are the district attorneys. By using prosecutorial discretion, district attorneys can undermine the decisions that local executives have made in their crime policy and ensure that the way that they're enforced is out of whack with the way that they were meant to be enforced when they were passed by the local legislature and implemented by the police. Secondly, though, and I think this is really important, there's a gap between the funding and the implementation of the policy. That is, it is the local executive who controls the power, or the local legislature that controls the power of the prosecutors, controls their budget, and prioritize it. But it's the prosecutors who actually have to rest within those resources. So I think the problem with this is that they're being held accountable for the limited resources that are available to them, but don't have control over to what extent those resources are. Now listen, if they're working at the pleasure of the executive, that's not an issue. So for these reasons, we're glad to propose.
Thank you, Matt. Call upon Adam.
Okay, well, of course, thanks to everyone here. Thanks to Gov for an interesting case. Of course, thanks to Michelle. Excellent speech from her to come. Of course, thanks to you in particular and to Princeton in general for an excellent tournament. I want to start out with exactly explaining what it is that I think DAs do and what their position is within our legal system and within our government, and why that position is kind of more in line with what we think of as an elected position. Right? Recognize that we give a lot of discretion to DAs, right? Prosecutorial discretion. They get to decide how we enforce laws, what kinds of cases are brought to trial, what kinds of laws are top priority to enforce, right? These are essentially policy considerations. It's not like there's always just kind of the one obvious thing and we see who can do it well, right? Civil service type hiring is good when it's a post office and everyone agrees on what exactly it should be doing and what the good postman is like. But people don't always agree on what the good DA would be doing, right? I mean, I really don't see how, like, the boards that they talk about are going to make a good decision about who it is who's most careful in deciding when to pursue the death penalty. Right? I don't think there's any sort of reasonable standard you could possibly expect these boards to have. And I think as a result, what's going to happen is that either they ignore this, in which case it's just kind of random based on who happens to be in that position, or they bow to political pressure in a kind of indirect way, in which case you're getting an ineffective way of getting the same kind of benefits that we get under elections. So I think it's clear that they actually do make policy decisions, and given that we expect policy to be democratically decided upon by our country, I think it's therefore good to give a democratic check. The next thing I want to talk about is government credibility, because I think it's really important that people trust the district attorney, that they have, that, you know, their town, their county has to deal with. Why is this? Because the district attorney is allowed to basically just choose to let people go, right? Choose not to follow through on a particular case, a particular crime, whatever it is. And I think it's really important that people understand why that is happening, have some faith in that person, and have something they feel they can do about it if they disagree with the decision. I think it promotes confidence in the government, both for this kind of mirage effect, where you just feel like you have more control over how the district attorney functions. Where if you disagree with them, there's something you can do, and the government doesn't feel like this kind of abstract foreign entity to you. I think people like that kind of, that kind of influence over their government. But I also think it actually does have an effect. That when people are able to, vote on what kind of district attorney they want, the fact that a district attorney is prioritizing certain neighborhoods, or, looking at certain types of crime, crimes that the community doesn't care as much about, ignoring other types of crimes. Those kinds of things are things that can be affected by a political decision, but they don't show up on this kind of who's the best prosecutor report. And with that brings me to my third point, which is the problems with their particular process, right? With the committee that they want to have do this, right? Now, first of all, recognize that they want these people appointed by the civil service union for the prosecutors, one that doesn't exist, by the way, right? But they will exist, they claim. And then they will be perfect. Now, the problem is, there aren't usually that many prosecutors in a particular area, right? This isn't like a massive industry. So individual prosecutors are going to have substantial sway within the union, right? It's going to be a political organization, and people who want to move on are going to be moving on partly as a favor by the people who control that union. I think it is going to become a political process. It's going to become a corrupt process, and it's going to mean that to move up, you have to make friends with other prosecutors in the right way, actually, make these connections. Now, recognize too that they want to have judges on these committees, right? I think it's a problem to have the judges that are going to be hearing the cases, choose the prosecutors that are going to be arguing in front of them. Right? This is first of all a problem just because they are likely to choose judges, the prosecutors they like, or that they agree with, that they're going to be biased towards them in the future when they actually come to argue, but also because as assistant DAs, they're going to be arguing in front of that judge, trying to make it so the judge would want them to become DAs. This means things like not overturning them on appeal, right? Like things judges will not be happy with. I don't think this is the kind of group that can easily make this decision. Right? I also don't know how you measure success, right? Like, who brings the most cases, who has the highest conviction rate. I don't know how you measure plea bargains into this, right? Does this make it more likely you take plea bargains or less likely, or like some sort of weird calculation based on whatever statistics this group decides to collect? I don't think it actually leaves the decisions about individual cases up to the DAs themselves to make a good decision. I also think that there's just no clear accountability for this board, right? Recognize that when the board is a compromise between this one group and this other group, and is made partially of people from this group, even though that's not one of the groups making the compromise between the, Like, okay, the result is no one's actually responsible for what this board does. You can't actually blame anyone when the board becomes stupid and starts appointing dumb DAs who aren't good at their job. When you don't have someone who's clearly responsible, when everyone can wave their hand at the other person or the other 50 people who were involved in making this board and say it was their fault, the result is you can't do anything when problems arise.
Adam, sure. So if we buy all the arguments that you've given us up to this point, why shouldn't we elect federal prosecutors?
Well, I mean, if there aren't any other considerations, I'd say we should, right? If there's something particular to federal prosecutors, then we could argue about that. Like, is it really not that? Now, going back to case side though, and there's some of their response to this. So they say it depoliticizes the process, right? And they say, well, it's important to enforce legislation the way the legislature and the executive intended, right? Right. The executive, like this is part of the executive, right? Like DAs are members of the executive branch, actually are part of the people we elect to choose how to enforce these laws, right? They don't simply use prosecutorial discretion based on how the legislature intended this law to be, to be put forward. They actually weigh different laws and things like that that the legislature didn't take into account, actually reach policy decisions of their own. They say they want political investigations to be neutral. And here's one of the great things about the fact that this is set in the local level. Generally, when there's a political investigation at the local level, they bring in federal law enforcement to do the investigation, because federal law enforcement doesn't have these conflicts of interest. So problem solved, no worry about that. Then they say, well, there'll be less grandstanding. Right, I mean, I think it is true that there will be less, attempt to win over the political process in this particular way. but I think it will just be replaced by other incentives to win over this board in ways that are equally harmful. Besides that, though, I don't think it's always so bad when the prosecutor tries to make a big deal of the fact that they're now prosecuting criminals in this region. I think that's good for things like deterrence, good for the confidence that people have in the system. Then they say, well, the skill is different, right? First of all, this is a problem with all elected offices, right? Like the skill to actually do well once you're elected is different than the skill involved in running. But I actually think the job of the district attorney is fundamentally different. The district attorney isn't spending all of their time actually arguing in a courtroom. Often those are assistant district attorneys. The district attorney is running the office and actually deals with public relations, deals with actually promoting the law enforcement community within the general population, explaining things like prosecutorial decisions to the media. And I think that kind of ability to deal with the public actually is important to the job. Then they give this weird reason why the boards will be perfect. I don't understand. Like previous results, yes. Like if boards were great, their experience would help. Only if you could evaluate people reasonably. Then they say you get the right people, right? And they say, well, there's no upward mobility, right? I mean, there's some, right? Obviously, it stops at a point, but they're also stopping at a point. It's just a slightly higher point. Right? But I also think this is just true of every civil service job, right? Like at some point within our government, you get high enough that it becomes an appointed or elected position or a political appointment rather than a civil service job. This is always true. We pay people reasonably well and we get decent people to work in the jobs. I don't think the executive control arguments make any sense because this is still kind of a weird and separate branch not controlled by the executive. You still have the accountability problems. We're very proud of it.
Thank you, Adam. Let's call upon Andrew.
Here, here.
The problem in the status quo is that it's not just that there's one executive operating and making the decisions about crime policy in any locality. It's that there are multiple executives, multiple elected executives with different interests. And those differing interests means that they're going to have different policies, make different and in fact contradictory decisions. This is going to create chaos in crime policy, and I think that's something that side opposition simply doesn't understand. So I'm going to move into the flow that they give us. The first thing they talk about are how these are positions that should be elected, that we give DAs a lot of discretion, that we allow them to enforce and prioritize decisions, and so they should bow, and they would bow indirectly to political questions. But I think the relevant actors agree on what good crime policies are. That is, the legislative and the executive, the people who are responsible for determining what crime priorities are, in what amounts they should be funded, what specific acts should be considered crimes and should not be considered crimes. That is not the responsibility of the district attorney. The district attorney's responsibility is to implement the policy decided upon by the legislative and by the executive who has particular responsibilities in the legislative process. The DA has no responsibilities in the legislative process. So by making alternative decisions, the DA is in effect nullifying legislative decisions made by normal legislative and democratic processes. We think that's completely unacceptable. The responsibility of the district attorney is to enact the policies of the executive and of the legislature. They don't have a role in this policy-making process. I also think that the voters simply can't make these kinds of decisions about who should be a district attorney. The voters making these kinds of decisions, even if side opposition thinks they should be somewhat political decisions, I think the decision about who politically is best at enacting the policies of the executive is a meritocratic decision. We've given you arguments about why our side is more meritocratic. We haven't heard anything from side opposition about how there's going to be how merit's going to be taken into consideration fairly on this side of the house. No, thank you. The second argument they talk about is how it's important to trust the DA. This is closely tied to the first one. They say DAs should make choices about choosing to let people go. We should have faith that people should have recourse. There should be like decisions about prioritizing certain neighborhoods and things like that. Well, I think a good analogous example is the Foreign Service, which has a very similar promotion system to the service we're setting up today. We have immense faith that our foreign servants, the people actually on the ground in other countries, are making meaningful decisions, even though they have incredible amounts of latitude about the way U.S. policy is actually implemented in any other country, be it China or any nation in Africa. But we have faith in them because we know that there's a sufficiently meritocratic system which ensures that the appropriate people, the people with the most experience and the best judgment, are making those kinds of decisions, and that they're not responsible to political processes, and they're not coming back and asking for the vote of Congress or anyone else when it comes to what they should be doing. So insofar as there are political concerns, it's not even clear why the evaluators can't take those into consideration. Remember, the evaluators are senior prosecutors, are judges who've been agreed on by the executive who has to take into account political concerns, as well as the union which has to take into account political concerns. The point is that they check against each other, so the political concerns are outweighed, but the political concerns can still, politicization can be outweighed, but key political decisions like the consensus that we should prioritize some neighborhoods over others can still be taken into consideration. It can just be evaluated in addition to the other questions, the questions about merit, rather than having it simply be the exclusive question. Okay.
Political and democratic are different. The fact that these unions are going to be political in their decisions doesn't mean that actually brings into account a democratic decision about policy.
Right, so the point is that the sort of like appealing to the people democratic willist is responded to by the executive, who has to go back and ask for re-election. But in order to ensure that the executive isn't manipulating things in an unduly political way, we have the union, which is not responsible to the voters, but is a political actor, which checks directly against that. That's how they work against each other. So the third thing they talk about is they try to critique our union for the civil service, and they first sort of come up and say, we think this idea is ridiculous. Well, actually, this idea is completely not ridiculous. Almost all civil servants in municipalities are already in a union. It's the American Federation for State, County, and Municipal Employees. So everyone else in the county or in the municipality is already in a union. Also, federal prosecutors are in a union. So it doesn't seem like a huge leap to say prosecutors in counties and municipalities should be in a union. That seems like an incredibly intuitive argument. So the first argument they talk about how this should be political, I think I just dealt with that under their second point. The second thing that I talk about are how prosecutors will want to make friends with judges and people like that. Well, I think that incentive already exists to make friends with judges. I think like if you want to have the best win-loss record, so you can take that back to your constituents and say, I won 100% of my cases, that's an incentive to make friends with prosecutors. Further, I don't think this is a comparative argument here. They say there's going to be prosecutors will want to make friends with judges, and judges will want to protect prosecutors. Maybe that's the case, but I think that's completely different and in fact smaller than scale than what they have to defend on their side of the house, namely prosecutors who go back to the average people who don't want to just make friends with judges who, even if they will corrupt justice a little bit on their side of the house, they're not going to completely overturn justice. Rather, on their side of the house, they have to defend prosecutors who have to go back to all of the citizens, who have to go back to the electoral body and ask them for their support, which means they have to make friends with many more competing interests than just the interests of the judges. Okay.
So what you're saying is, you have a really big problem with prosecutors turning to the public and saying, I'm putting the criminals in your neighborhood into jail, but you have no problem with them going to judges and saying, I am in line with your personal beliefs and I'm your friend.
No, I think we have less of a problem with prosecutors going to judges and say, I have a similar conception of justice with you, than we do prosecutors going to competing interests within a municipality and saying, I'm going to put your people in prison, people who are aligned with your beliefs, but not people who are aligned with their beliefs, because I want your votes and not theirs. I think that's much more problematic for their side of the house. That's what they have to defend. The last thing they talk about are like, how are you going to measure questions like this? I think that's why we didn't propose a case where it's like, ADAs, when there are DA vacancies, ADAs who have like 80% win-loss records should automatically be promoted above other people. There has to be a case-by-case review. The fact of the matter is that the best way to do a case-by-case review are people who actually understand the considerations, the key questions which weigh on prosecutors. This is why, for medical malpractice, it's great if we can have doctors who can evaluate the decision-making processes, which are unique to doctors when they have to make medical decisions. Similarly, we want people who can evaluate the specific questions unique to prosecutors when they make their decisions. I think the best way to do that is to have a board rather than the electorate. So at this point, I'd like to move case side and talk about some of the things we talked about. The first thing Matt talks about is depoliticization. He gives 4 arguments about why there should be why this case depoliticizes. The first argument is about how voters are not the voters aren't policymakers. The DAs should just be enforcing the law. The response we get are DAs are part of the executive. We agree that DAs are part of the executive. We think they act in similar ways to other parts of the executive, but we don't elect all of the enforcers of executive decisions, and we don't think DAs should be making independent decisions from the executive. The second thing we talk about is the third parties. They say usually federal prosecutors come in, but there are local political laws too. So federal prosecutors come in to prosecute federal legal violations in voter fraud, but localities can have their own voting regulations. The third thing we talk about are less grandstanding. They say there are other incentives for the board. Yeah, the number one incentive for getting promoted by the board, merit. We're fine with that. The fourth thing Matt talks about is the incentive to over-prosecute, which isn't checked for. I think that's completely dropped by the yellow. On meritocracy, we talk about how skill in court is not the same thing as skill in campaigns. Maybe there's a momentary paradigm of politicization when the DA has to explain it to the public. But I think that's outweighed by the legal decision-making and the questions of prosecutorial discretion, which are life and death for the defendant and have to be made by someone who actually knows what they're doing, not a friend of someone else. They talk about how, we talk about how voters don't read performance evaluations. And I think we evaluate them. They talk about how we only stop promotion at a higher point. The point is that once you get to be a DA, you can make meaningful decisions. You can be your own boss. We think that that's a meaningful thing that will check further ambition. And then they drop our third point about how this preserves executive accountability, which I think is particularly important. It's for those reasons that we're practical voters.
I think Andrew will call upon Michelle.
Well, thanks a lot to everyone, particularly to Side Government for an interesting case, and Adam for a great speech still to come. To all you guys for judging, and to Princeton for the tournament, I want to make sure right now that you guys are taking careful notes, because I have a feeling, if past experience is any judge, that you're going to hear in PMR that we gave no speeches and answered nothing. So be careful. I'm going to say a lot. So
That was my plan last night.
yeah, it usually is. So the first thing that we hear from Andrew is that there are multiple. He talks about how there are multiple elected executives, and that we shouldn't let this particular part of the executive branch actually have power. Like yes, we have the district attorney, we have the local mayor. Perhaps they won't be in line on every single issue. We also have the governor, who probably isn't in line with the mayor on every single issue. There are a lot of executives who are relevant to this decision, and we don't think that we should arbitrarily say this particular executive, well, you're probably the lowest rung executive in this particular segment of the ladder, so probably let's screw you over and not let you have any say. But then later, Andrew tells us that this is a life and death decision, and the DAs make really meaningful decisions, set really meaningful policy. And so I think if the decisions that the district attorney is making are so meaningful, are so important, then we should maybe ask the municipality what kind of law enforcement they want, if the philosophy that the DA has such a huge impact on the outcome. So Adam starts out by talking to you about what district attorneys do in the first place, that we actually do allow them a lot of discretion, that they actually do have a big philosophy that's important here, and that the kind of hiring, the decision-making process when they talk about merit as being this discrete and obvious criterion, just doesn't make any sense when it's such a gray area, right? They talk about how there's this risk of district attorneys nullifying legislation. Response. They tell us, what if the district attorney makes some decision that's exactly opposite to what the legislature asked? But I don't think this is the kind of decision that they're making, right? The district attorneys are setting priorities, are trying to decide how to allocate the scarce resources that they have. I don't think the legislature decided on exactly what the priorities should have been for the prosecutors to have, right? They said, this is a crime, punishable by X, and this other thing is a crime, punishable by Y, right? And the prosecutor has to say, we have a limited amount of time and money and physical people, right? So we have to punish drug crimes, we have to punish fraud. How are we going to allocate our time? I think that's a decision that's really meaningful for them to be making and isn't nullifying the legislation in any way. Then we hear again, meritocracy is good. That would be really nice. I mean, yes, things that have merit are good, and when we prioritize things that have merit, that's a good thing. I concur. But if you don't have a clear standard for what exactly constitutes merit, then I don't think you can claim that you get meritocracy on their side. I'll have plenty of examples for this throughout the case, not this time. The second thing that we talk about is government credibility in general. That people should be able to trust the district attorney, that there's this meaningful connection between individuals and how much they trust in law enforcement. Now in response we get this example. What about the foreign service? What about people who are serving in China? Now, to be fair, I don't think that we expect the same kind of relationship between the people that interact with our, I don't know, I guess ambassador to China and people in the United States who are citizens of the US and actually, vote on US policy. So I think this example is kind of a non sequitur in this round, but I would also point out that look, he can give you some examples of people who are appointed who do well, and we can give you some examples of people who are elected who do well. But at the end of the day, this round has to be about which one of those styles of choosing people for the office actually apply in this case. We've given you lots of arguments why this particular policy wouldn't work well. Sure.
So I totally agree that that's the relevant question that is around. So I'm going to give you a second shot at the question I asked Adam. why should we not elect federal prosecutors?
Well, I think a lot of the arguments that we've been making have a lot to do with municipalities and the particular concerns that might be facing a region, right? As Adam said, if every single factor that applied to local areas was precisely true on the federal scale, we would support all our arguments still being true there, right? But I don't think that the situation that local district attorneys are in is the same as federal prosecutors, right? They deal with the entire country, which is different from a small neighborhood with very direct and specific concerns. Not at this time. Then they tell you political concerns will check against each other in these magical union committees of awesome. Now, I think this is a particularly interesting argument to make the day after APTA elections take place. Because I don't think it's clear that when you assemble a bunch of people, say the APTA board, with separate and personal interests in the outcome of some sort of political process, that those separate political interests will be directly opposite each other and will all cancel out to zero, and the process will be perfectly happy and wonderful. I think empirically, APTA knows that this is not the case, right? Why would they cancel? Why would their interests be directly opposite each other? It's very possible that there will be, I don't even know what vector space there is. I just don't think that this argument has a lot of room. And moreover, I don't think they addressed the argument Adam actually was making in the first place, right? This interaction between the individuals and the government, this trust in law enforcement that I think you only get when you get some input from the actual people. Then we talk about problems with the committee, right? And Andrew takes a moment to explain that he does think the union will exist. There are plenty of civil servants. Fine. But we just don't think that this union will work out as well. They sort of assume that it will be great. I don't think that there's evidence for that. Then we talk about how there will be all these political pressures that are very strange. We say, look, there's a small number of prosecutors in the area. When you look to some subset of a small number of people, you're going to end up with a couple of people getting a really large say, right? Now, what they tell you is it'll be better than electing them, as though the kind of message that's sent to a small group of people is necessarily better than the message sent to a large group of people. What I pointed out in my POI is I think the message that's being sent to the community is not an objectionable one. And letting them vote on the kind of law enforcement philosophy they care about is a really important idea. Whereas their position puts a lot of individuals with a lot of power, right? It puts a whole new twist on appointing judges in the first place, right? I think there are a lot of problems that come out of the system they have that give individuals a lot of power, right? Whether or not you seek the death penalty as a prosecutor will come into play. What types of cases you allow plea bargaining for. The distinction is not just a pure merit one. It's not just a pure abstract success one. There's a lot of philosophy that comes into play that gives a lot of people personal discretion. He doesn't really respond to how to measure this accurately, and he doesn't answer the accountability argument. He just tells us later that we drop it when we cross-apply this argument to his third point. So going back case side, the first thing they talk about is how it depoliticizes the process. Right? We tell you that they're still part of the executive, fine, that federal law enforcement is different, and so forth. Then the response we hear is, well, we don't elect all people in the enforcement branch. Well, we elect some of them. Again, we're making a decision here, and we're making arguments about this case. And then he moves very quickly on to merit. Merit is really great. Like I said before, we're pro-merit on-site opposition. We just don't think that there's a clear way to judge it, and we can't necessarily defer to these people to figure out exactly how merit is going to be decided. He tells you it's a life and death issue for the defendant. The DA makes really meaningful decisions. And I think when these decisions are so important to people, what you actually have to look at is what the people who are going to be receiving that law enforcement want their law enforcement to be. That's why we have that mechanism there in the first place, to actually serve the community, to figure out what kinds of crimes desperately need to be addressed in that area. I think it's a meaningful and important distinction to allow that person to say to the community, I will solve the problems that you have, this is what I care about, and then be held accountable for actually solving those problems. Then he claims we don't talk about their accountability point, right? We tell you that it's still a weird and separate system where everyone can blame everyone else for any possible bad outcomes. We don't think that that's better accountability, and we're very proud of it.
I thank Michelle and call upon Adam again.
Well, of course, thanks to everyone there. I think it's been an interesting round. I want to start out by just asking what exactly is merit, right? Because they talk a lot about how their side promotes it. But I think if they don't even know what it is, it's pretty clear that their side doesn't promote it. So we tell you that these are policy considerations, that it's prioritizing different types of crime different levels of cases, right? Do you go after the small cases or the big cases more? Do you put in a lot of money to go after that death penalty case when your county can't really afford it? Do you seek the death penalty at all? Do you seek it only in very extreme circumstances, or do you use it whenever you're legally allowed to? These are policy considerations. I don't see what possible conception of merit allows the board to evaluate whether these decisions are reached well. I just don't believe that there's any way this can actually happen. So given that, what do they tell you? Like, we specifically get an MO that the judges will be picking based on like the ADA that agrees with their judicial philosophy, right? It's like very weird. I don't see how that's any better than the electorate picking based on their judicial philosophy and how they believe that the district attorney should be actually doing this, right? Look, what we also tell you is that the qualifications for district attorney are fundamentally different than those for assistant district attorney, that the job description is fundamentally different, and you can't just rely on success in one to be success in the other. The skills that are involved in campaigning are much more relevant to a district attorney than they are to an assistant. So you can't just use this kind of straightforward calculus of merit. They say, well, we're just going to do it on this case-by-case basis. But either there's going to be an objective process, or there isn't going to be. There's an objective process. There's no way it could possibly work. We talk about things like plea bargains that would screw it up completely. But if there isn't going to be an objective process, then all you have is much more politicization of the process, much more problems. Which brings me to my second point. Will these boards actually work on merit? Right? We give you a lot of problems with this, right? Like the union is going to have, internal politics. And they say, well, right, there's this politics and there's these other politics, so somehow this becomes good. I don't know how. I think it's pretty clear that what we will just have is trading of corrupt favors, rather than one person imposing their corrupt wishes on everyone else, right? I don't see how it's actually beneficial, right? Obviously, people who are connected within the union will do better in getting these appointments. Obviously, people who try cases in a way that judges like will be more, capable of getting these appointments. Obviously, the judges will be swayed by their considerations of these things when they hear cases later. We don't actually think it results in merit. Right? But we also tell you there's no way to oversee the board, right? When there's no one responsible for the board's decisions, there's nothing to check against these political concerns. When there's no one who's clearly responsible for what the board does, when the board itself is this weird conglomeration of other interests, you don't have any way to deal with the kind of corruption that always naturally exists within a process of this kind, right? And when you don't have any sort of mechanism of dealing with it, you just have these problems running out of control. The final thing I want to talk about is democracy. I think it's just a fundamental good within society that individuals and societies and localities get to decide on the kind of policy that they want to have. And that's what we give you on our side of the house. We allow localities to choose the particular type of law enforcement that they believe is best for them. We allow them to feel like their officials are accountable, to have some faith in their government, because they have someone who's clear and responsible and who they can complain to and who they can vote against if they don't like them. They feel like the decisions being reached actually reflect what they believe. And even if they were exactly the same decisions on both sides of the house, I think it's preferable on our side of the house where people feel like those decisions are really being reached on their behalf, rather than just decisions that are being pushed into some weird back room where the different political entities, some of which are elected, some of which are not, some of which are appointed by random other people, have to negotiate in this weird way to come up with this committee that is then going to negotiate over who they elect, or who they appoint, rather, to then make decisions based on a case-by-case basis. We've lost all connection to reality, all connection to politics, all connection to the democratic process. That's not good. We're proud to oppose.
So I knew there was a potential when I ran a case that was come up with by a panel of law professors that there was going to be a potential for confusion. But I swear if you stay with me, if you understand this proposal clearly, we're winning this round. All right, I want to break it down very simply. We think there are two problems with the way that prosecution works at the local level of right now in the status quo. The first problem is that there's dueling executive authorities. That is, we appoint a county, or we elect a county executive or a mayor and put them in charge of governing an area, protecting people's rights, and enforcing a crime policy. But then we elect a second executive that is in charge of actually implementing the policy. So we think the first problem is that the district attorney needs to be subordinate to the local executive, so they're consistent with the policies that the executive and the local legislator are advocating. We don't think that's enough, because we think there's a second related problem to it. The second related problem is that right now, DAs are totally political, that they grandstand and make these political decisions that are interfering with prosecutorial discretion and making the system less about merit. So we need to have some way to ensure that the system is based on merit, but is also accountable to the executive. So we need to get two parties in on the decisions of who to make. Well, who should those two parties then be? They probably should include the local executive, and the other one that it should include is people who have insight into prosecutorial merit, probably people who are prosecutors themselves. So what we're saying is these two groups of individuals should be empowered to select a committee that's accountable to them that makes these decisions. Now, obviously, we don't want the executive spending all of their days deciding who should and shouldn't be a prosecutor. That's why we have these judges and these prosecutors actually making those decisions on a day-to-day basis. But who are they accountable to? Local executives, and they're accountable to prosecutorial unions who know what prosecutorial meriters are. It's a complicated system, but I don't think they've explained why it's not a bad system. And Michelle gets up here in her MO and she says, we have dueling executives all the time. We have like mayors and governors, but they're totally missing the point. They operate at differing levels of government, right? And it's okay in a federal system for that to happen. But the problem is, these are two layers of executive power at the same level of government that could be advocating for inconsistent policies, and undermining one another. That's why we don't think we have a system that's working. Remember, I keep asking them this question throughout the round. This idea, why don't we do this for federal prosecutors as well? We somehow managed to depoliticize that, make it purely a matter of merit, and do it on an appointment-based process. And their only answer is, well, there are some things that are different in municipalities. I don't think we've ever gotten any reason other than this one reason, which is there's a greater potential for corruption at the lower level because like everyone knows each other. Well, this makes sense intuitively, but Roebuck is a killer response in the MG that the MO doesn't respond to, which is his response is, this exists in the status quo. Listen, if there are only like 5 lawyers in the county to begin with, if you want to get a fair hearing from the judge and you want the judge to be on your side, you have an incentive to suck up to the judge in the status quo right now, and this doesn't worsen it in a meaningful way. What this case does do is make 3 important changes. Gets rid of bad politics, that is, the politics of abuse of the system, brings in good politics, that is the politics of accountability, and makes the system more meritocratic. So here's the problem with bad politics. We get these politically motivated trials like the Nifong's trial in North Carolina, and telegenic DAs who all they care about is responding to what the voters want. And they say, well, the community should become involved. But our argument is that the community can't make the decisions correctly. The most important argument in this round, and I swear this was a real draft, I'm not making it up. Look at the bottom of my first argument. I made this argument that there's a strong incentive to over-prosecute right now. Because you have pressures to keep criminals off the streets at any cost, even if it involves trampling on minority rights. Never been a response to that. Why is this argument so important in this round? Because Michelle in her MO gets up here and she says, don't you think that the people who should make decisions about how prosecution is done are the people who live in this society, you know, where these people could go out and commit crimes? The problem is, that's exactly the mindset of voters. All they think about is the bottom line in terms of, is crime happening? Are criminals off the street? What they don't weigh, which is what's on the other side of the question, which is, were defendants' rights being representative? Because criminal defendants don't have powerful lobbying groups. That's the argument we've been making. Those are the bad politics that they have on their side of the house that we solve for. So what we get on our side of the house, though, is the good politics, which is political accountability. We have a group that's accountable, yes, indirectly, but accountable to the local executives. So guess what? If the prosecutors are behaving in a way that's not acceptable to the local population, what do? Lobby against your county executive, lobby against your mayor, kick them out of office. They're held accountable for their own policies. The problem right now is crime policy, the mayor is held accountable for it, and the DA is held accountable for it as well, even if they're advocating inconsistent agendas. We resolve that inconsistency. The final argument that matters in this round is why meritocratic decisions are better ones. And so they've tried to say on their side of the house that they reject our view that skill in campaigning and skill in office are different. Because they say what's important is that the district attorney relate well to the public, right? That it's different than being an assistant district attorney. The problem is this argument just relies on intuitions that we have that the process should be political. They've never given us a reason for why it should be the case that prosecutors are responsible for dealing with the public rather than just enforcing the laws that the public's representatives in the executive and the legislature have passed. Listen, I know it's a complicated case. I know it's a system that involves a lot of nuance and position, but I don't actually think they've explained explained why voters can make these decisions better, and why political prosecutors, just because intuitively accept it now because it's the status quo, are the way it ought to be. We're proud to propose.